Well, hello, and welcome to week 6 of Liturgies and Pentecostal Ministry. After this week, there's actually only one more lesson. We have 2 more weeks, but just one more lesson after this week. And then after that, you have your writing week for your final paper. But this week is really, for me personally, the crux of the entire class. This is a very important topic for me, not just the communion aspect that we're going to get from Tomlinson, but also what Smith brings out. And we'll speak about each of those on their own. But first of all, Tomlinson, talking about communion. For me, communion has always been a very special part of my worship experience from early on as a new Christian. Although I was raised in the church, raised in the Methodist church, and I don't offer any disparaging words about that, but really I didn't have a born again experience until I was 18 years old and entered into a Pentecostal experience of faith. And from that point on, communion held a very special place for me. And actually, my father-in-law was my first pastor, and he always made communion very special. We practiced communion once a month. And it was just a very special time. But as I began to grow in my faith and grow in my understanding, especially through my academic pursuits, I began to realize that communion held a very important place within the history of the church. And Tomlinson does a good job of bringing that out. There's much more that can be said about that. He just scratches the surface on that, and I would encourage you to explore that more. But there is this important aspect of communion that has always held a high rank within the church, within our practice, and within our theology. And for me, as I began to explore these things, I began to realize that there was a deficiency in our theology of communion. And Tomlinson does a good job with this. And I'll just say this, that Tomlinson is actually building upon other theologians. Chris Thomas, which I'll introduce to you next week with foot washing, but also Ken Archer. And this whole idea of the way of salvation. Tomlinson brings this out, this idea of there is a way, a path. And so with communion, and the other liturgies, he's kind of building from what Chris Thomas and Ken Archer are offering. And really, communion is kind of the crux of it all. And again, I know I'm kind of stumbling over my words. I'm trying to articulate this in a way that I don't offend anybody. But for me personally, it was actually, there was a moment when I graduated from the seminary with my Master of Divinity, the Pentecostal Theological Seminary. The seminary has a connection with a seminary in London, in England, and there was a PhD graduate who was associated with Pentecostal Seminary and the seminary in England, and he was getting his PhD, and his dissertation was towards a Pentecostal theology of the Lord's Supper. And that just caught my eye. I'm sitting there in the audience as a graduate myself, and here this other graduate with a PhD comes and talks about a theology of communion. And that just struck me. And subsequently, his dissertation was printed into a book. And I'm going to get ahead of myself. I'll just introduce the book that I want to offer you as a resource this week. And that is Chris Green's book on Towards a Pentecostal Theology of the Lord's Supper, Foretasting the Kingdom. I don't have it with me. It's in my office at the church, but I do have the link there. And I would just say this. After reading that book, my whole theology of communion changed. And to the point where he offered, I think, 4 or 5 biblical passages that demonstrated the importance of communion within the early church and within our Christian tradition. And after reading Chris's book, I determined that I am, as a pastor, am going to introduce this theology to the churches that I pastor, and I'm going to work towards weekly communion. And when I say that, you know that as Pentecostals, we don't practice weekly communion like so many of the majority church does around the world, whether it's Roman Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopal, What else? Just the vast majority, Coptic Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, the vast majority of Christians throughout history and even today practice weekly communion. And so I began to ask myself, why not us? Why don't we? And there's some arguments about that, and I don't want to get into that. One of them is that if we take communion too often, we minimize its meaning. And I always push back and say, no, we already have to minimize its meaning by not practicing it as often as we should. And so, again, let me just get back to Chris's book. After reading his book, I determined to do that. And so I introduced this to a church in Alabama. It took me 3 years to do that. And I kind of worked with them. I didn't push them all at once. I just began to teach on it. And I write about that experience in my doctoral thesis, which actually is online. If you're interested in looking at that, it's there. But I used the church in Alabama, a very small rural church. When we got there, there was only 20 people there. And when we left, there was about 60 people. But we worked in that community and introduced to them actually what Tomlinson is offering in this book, from baptism to foot washing to anointing with oil and the Eucharist. But we introduced that, and it was a great success. And I have left that church now about 3 years, and they're still practicing weekly communion, this small Pentecostal church in rural Alabama. We practice weekly communion in the church that I pastor now here in Cleveland, Tennessee, New Covenant Church of God. It's just something that we as a people just believe it's important to do. And I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but let me just challenge you as ministers to dig into the theology of communion. Again, Tomlinson does a good job of kind of scratching the surface, getting our taste buds wet to really see what's going on there. But it's a very important aspect of my life and theology is communion. Well, let me just say just a couple of words about Smith as well. Here in Smith's argument, I am fully engaged with what he is saying, fully in agreement with what he's saying. I have a real challenge personally with children's ministry and even youth ministry that is separated from adult ministry, especially on Sunday mornings. It is my opinion that we have done the church a great disservice by taking our children out of the worship experience and trying to give them a more flavorful, a more child-appealing service. And we've been doing that actually about 50 years. If you look at the history of children's ministry, although there's been children's ministry all through the ages, but this idea of having a separate children's church, right, from the adult church, whatever that means, right? You have adult church, children's church. That's only been a phenomenon that's been going on for about 50 years. And I think about where we are in North America, in Europe, although it's not as prevalent in Europe. This is really a North American thing. Where we are and where our children are as far as their understanding of even the doctrines of the church, how we're constantly talking about just the challenge of discipleship. We're talking about the challenge of keeping our children. Once they hit 16, 17, 18, they begin to be able to drive, they're working, and boom, they disappear. I don't know if that's been your experience, but that's been my experience in the church, is that it's just hard to retain our children. And that is, I believe, what Smith gets to, is that we just haven't been adequately forming them from early ages to appreciate what goes on in church, what is offered in church, and that is the didactic ways in which the liturgies form us into the people of God. And so as you read through Smith, I hope you'll understand that. And I really look forward to some engagement on that and what it means to perhaps get the kids back into the church service. And yes, offer them Wednesday night services and discipleship services, Sunday school. But we need to get our children back into the sanctuary. That's my opinion. I would love to talk to you about that online. Well, that's really about all I have to say with the lessons this week. I would like to just thank you for getting your papers. Most of you getting your papers in on time. Good job with that. I think I left a note with that, and just kind of looking over them. Most of the formatting is looking better this time around. There was a few challenges with some of the cover pages, and I made a note about that. But good job with that. I want to encourage you, start researching and writing your final paper. you're going to get to that last week and you're going to have people, sick in your church, or you're going to have, some type of emergency come up, and you're going to say, hey, I don't have time to write this. Well, you've had all semester to write your paper. And I will say that while I will perhaps take your papers maybe a week after they're late, I shouldn't even be saying this, but you will be docked severely for late papers. For every day that it's late, it's 5 to 10 points off. So if you're 5 days late, just think of that. So you want to get these papers in on time. You want to begin to really research them, get your resources together, get on Atla, start typing out your topic and try to find those resources. Listen, if you're having a hard time with that, let me know. And I have time. I can help you perhaps find some. I'm not going to do your research for you, but I'll help guide you to those resources. So again, I can't say this strongly enough. Get your research done. Get your paper writing done. Don't wait till the last week to begin. You will not get it in, and you will get a grade that will affect your final grade in the end. Obviously, all of you, I think most of you, have A's right now. It's just an easy A, right? You just get online, and that your paper will bring your grade down if you're not careful. So that's a warning, not a threat, okay? And so anyways, hey, I got to get this online. Have a great week. We'll see you as we post together and discuss these chapters together. Amen. God bless. Bye-bye.